Eric Taylor again, your professor for American History 140. United States History to 1877. And just give you an overview this week of the chapter in the module, which is on the Transforming the American Economy is the title of the chapter in your textbook. And so what we're talking about this week is something that, to be honest, I was never that interested in when I was a student, which is economic history. But as we're going to see, and you'll see in the chapter, and what we're going to emphasize here, are the social changes that occur because of several major revolutions, as the term historians give to them, in the economic realm in the early 19th century in America. The biggest and most important being the Industrial Revolution. America begins, it doesn't end before the Civil War, but begins the process of becoming an industrialized economy in the northeastern part of the country, in the north. And so you have these changes in economic life, which are profound. I will go through some of this in this little video here, and you'll read some of this in the textbook. But you can't overstate them, I don't think. They're that important. One of the biggest changes, really, in all of human history, because of the way it reshapes not just American, but every society it touches. In modern contemporary terms, countries in the last 15 years in the developing world, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, industrialization is, well, it can be traumatic, actually. And it is traumatic in some ways, even in the less in the United States for various reasons, but in Europe it was a traumatic shift, and I'll tell you why in a second, show you why. But the big one is the Industrial Revolution, in which you have a change, not just from agricultural to more again, a manufacturing type of economy in the Northeast, but all the changes associated with it. And in fact, in the United States, as in Britain, there are several revolutions that sort of precede and go along with it, one being a change in agriculture, sometimes referred to an agricultural revolution, the use of mechanization, mechanized equipment. You can produce more food, so less people have to work on farms. That's a prerequisite for this. But also revolutions in your textbook will mention this, in the market, revolutions in transportation, the growth of railroads, connecting the country together in a more systematic way for the first time, building of roads at a larger level. Even, of course, as we'll get to other chapters, the country is expanding west, geographically speaking, across the continent. So all of these changes go together. And one of the reasons, by the way, that it's such a challenge to American society, and in Europe as well, begins in Britain first, really, but America is on the same general trajectory, is that it really overturns a lot of traditional aspects of society. To go from living and working on a farm, if you're a farm worker, life is very cyclical. It's very set in its ways. I mean, it doesn't change, for the most part, life on a farm. You work from sun up to sunrise. Your life is determined by the seasons, the daylight, all that stuff. To go from that in one generation to working in a factory where you work longer hours, well, most of the time, because you're not determined by the weather anymore. You're indoors. It's determined by the clock time. You can work 7 days a week. A lot of people do. There's no laws against making you work as long as the employer wants to work in the early 1800s, and they do. This will eventually be regulated later on. We'll get to this, end of this course, but in the next course, the second part of American history, you'll learn about that. But it's a big change, just in that respect. But even what it does to society, because this thing is hard to understand, both in early American society, but especially in Europe. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, wealth was not as essential to social status as it would become later. I know that may seem crazy, because wealthy people always have, of course, influence in society. But societies prior to the Industrial Revolution, rank could matter more than wealth. What do I mean by rank? Your birth, your social status. In pre-revolutionary France, a nobleman who had an old title would still have greater legal rights than a really wealthy who was at law a peasant, someone like a banker or something like a lawyer who made lots of money, he would still be inferior in law to the nobleman. And then just, of course, the idea that, and this is, by the way, the difference between a society based on, if you like, order or rank, birth, privilege, versus one based on class. And that's what the Industrial Revolution really produces for the first time. When we say class, we're not just talking about wealth. You're defined not only by your wealth, but your occupation. Are you manual labor, blue collar, if you like? Are you, a professional class? And it even creates something like the middle class for the first time, because you had people who were, lawyers, bankers, things we think of as being prototypically middle class prior to the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't have the influence they would have afterwards. Where now, because of the enormous amount of wealth that's being created, you have, a class which not only has, money, it has political influence. And so, this more, traditional way of looking at society gets overturned. What this means in practice, to give you an idea, I think I mentioned this before on one of my videos. In early America, poor people and rich people went to the same churches. They went to the same, houses of, whatever, attended the same, pubs and stuff like this. There weren't two separate cultures based on class as of yet. The Industrial Revolution will change all of that. The working class will create a working class, right? What do we mean by working class? Not just your money and how much money you have, but your occupation, who you hang around with. It really creates a division within American society that didn't exist before this. And this is important because, of course, one of the differences between early America and, say, Western Europe, Britain, they didn't have, I mentioned, societies based on order or rank. They didn't have title nobility in the United States. So it was a much more egalitarian society vis-a-vis the old world versus the old world and anywhere else, basically. And one of the reasons why industrialization was a threat in some ways to American society is because it's that sort of lack of, distinction. They still had, if you came from an old family in the Northeast or in Virginia, that gave you, not necessarily legal privileges, but it gave you social standing you wouldn't otherwise have. One of the reasons why it's threatening is, of course, there was a rough equality. Again, leave out slaves and women at this point. A rough equality that made Republican political ideals so powerful. And what industrialization does is upset this by creating those divisions of class which didn't exist before. So it's a big challenge to early American societies on several fronts. It also, by the way, has really, really serious effects on things like home life. Because now, one of the big things industrialization does is that it basically separates work from home life, especially the work of women. One of the things you're going to learn, you may never have known this, you're probably familiar at this point in your life with the idea that there's a traditional idea that women, their places in the home, taking care of the kids, and the men go out and work. Before the Industrial Revolution, that was not the case. And part of the reason was most people worked in their own homes or on their own farms. And on your own farms, of course, women helped out. They did work. Or you might have your own shop in a small town or a decent-sized city where you would sell things or whatever. And you'll learn about this in the textbook, the so-called putting out system, where, for example, making textiles, women would make textiles in their own homes. In other words, they would do work in the home. What happens, of course, as industries begin to change over to a factory system is that, of course, that work gets separated out into somewhere you go out to work. And there are, by the way, you'll learn about this in the readings for this week, factories that employ women. And they don't employ them, by the way, out of the goodness of their hearts. They employ them because they can pay them less, as they employ, by the way, child labor. Again, there are no laws against any of this in the early 19th century. But as you can see, this has a profound effect. What's going to happen, and particularly for the middle classes, this new middle class, and by the way, one reason why it's new, I mentioned before, both here and in England, I know England better than I know America, is that it creates a class that has political clout, but also has enough wealth for the first time where you can expect the wife not to work. Again, the guy makes me know the Industrial Revolution produces enormous amounts of wealth. It also produces enormous amounts of inequality, socially speaking. But it produces wealth for these middle-class people where your wife's not supposed to work now. It's also where your children aren't supposed to work, technically speaking. Again, before, you have a mouth to feed. Hey, you need to work on the farm and justify your, not justify your existence. You get what I mean. But kids would work. They would work in factories, by the way. They would have to in working class families. They didn't have enough money. They had to go from an early age, by the way. I mean, sometimes as young as 5 and 6 years old to go into these factories and work. But if you're middle class, all of a sudden you have wealth you hadn't had before. Or if you're going to get into more elite classes, and the textbook will talk about the divisions that it creates, that creates something very different. It creates, of course, the ideal that the woman's place is in the home and not in the public life of work, which is outside of it. So this is a huge change. You can't overdo it. You can't understate how big of a change that actually is. And so you have, again, you can't, these are all humongous changes. And again, I'm not a big, I don't find economic things all that, engaging, but this is about more than that, is my point. It's about a reshaping of American society. I don't mean to say, by the way, there aren't other sources for these changes besides economic ones. I'm definitely not an economic determinist, nor am I a materialist in terms of my approach to history. But it's huge. It changes people's habits of life in profound, some ways. I mean, amazing ways. One other example, when you're reading the textbook, America's cities began to spring up all over the place for the first time. It had been very few big cities in the early, in the colonial period. New York, Boston, a few others. Now all of a sudden they spring up everywhere. I say everywhere outside the South. The South, of course, remains an agricultural economy, and because of changes I mentioned changes in agriculture, the invention of the cotton gin is the big thing. It makes cotton viable. Actually, it makes it the most profitable thing they can sell, and it does. It makes the South insanely wealthy, but kind of traps it in a single, not a single, but a cash crop economy. But it makes the slave owners insanely wealthy. And also leads to a new boom in the slave trade, the internal slave trade, and its importance. So this has humongous ramifications for the economy and society in that regard. And by the way, when we say, it's producing cotton for those northern textile mills in the north, in those textile factories. So a lot of this is all interconnected. Lots of things going on of momentous import. So yeah, the Industrial Revolution, the creation of classes, the undermining of that older traditional notions of society, of rank and status, changing over to classes, the creation of those divisions, which, again, were threatened Republican ideals. And there are lots of people who write about this in the 19th century. All come to the fore because of this. And this goes in, I mentioned before, along with textbook will talk about this in more detail, the market and transportation revolutions, where you have, again, transportation becoming, connecting the country more and more. It probably helps create, more than anything, really regional divisions, because, as you'll see from the textbook, most of those railroad lines are being in the Northeast and the Midwest, not necessarily in the South. The South has only a few, really. It has less transportation. It remains, in some ways, of course, it remains backward because of slavery, but it also remains like an earlier Republican society. It's weird. I know it sounds strange, but it doesn't partake as directly. It does take indirectly because it's not like they're producing, a lot of things. They're producing cotton, and it makes the South. If the South, I believe, on the eve of the Civil War, you'll read this in the textbook later, it makes the South so wealthy that if it had been an independent country on its own, it would have been the wealthiest country in the world. That's how wealthy cotton makes the South. But it also means it has a different development because of that. But even it, of course, is can't be untouched by the transportation revolution, because you got to ship that cotton somehow. And so it partakes of the railway building and things of that nature. And my point is, would have happened there anyway had the Civil War not intervened. Is my point, almost assuredly. Just begins in the Northeast for a variety of reasons. And then finally, one last thing to mention about this, and the textbook gets this to the end. It's not totally related to to industrialization, but it is partly. In the 1840s, 30s and 40s, America experiences its first great wave of immigration. There had not been a lot of immigration from abroad up until then. And it comes mostly from Ireland, partly as a result of the potato famine in the 1840s, which caused a lot of Irish people, a lot of them to die, actually, because they didn't have enough food, but a lot of them came to America in large numbers for the first time, and causes social conflict. The Irish workers come in, they take jobs, particularly jobs in these factories, low-paying jobs, and it should be a familiar story to you by now, given what happened in the election and everything, and what's been going on for the last several years in this country. But for the first time, that also is a part of this process, because as you're going to see, by the way, I'll mention this, there's no actual immigration policy by the federal government in the 1840s. They don't regulate anything. Not until the 1860s does the United States government, for the first time, begin to actually, the federal government, I should say, begin to regulate immigration that way. And then, of course, why? They want to bring in cheap labor from overseas. This is all very familiar to you because it hasn't changed that much. But that begins in this period. So very formative in that regard. So that's the overview of the events for this chapter. In terms of source material, in the American Major Problems source reader, you're going to get excerpts from mostly from workers, well, and partly from workers who are going through all this. Farm workers. There's an excerpt by a slave describing what the life was like in the expansion of the slave trade, and it does, by the way. It changes. It becomes really more brutal, actually, in the western part. And I say western part of the United States. In the early republic is like Alabama, the cotton, the great cotton plantations of the western, Mississippi, Alabama, places like that. As it spreads, becomes more and more predominant there. You'll also get a couple of sources that one by John Quincy Adams, the president, who's calling for national infrastructure to help, things like transportation, stuff like that. You'll also have some sources on the role of women in all this. I think there's a source, I think it's a guidebook for women, how they should behave, those sorts of things. You'll find that interesting, to say the least. But you also take a look at, I think you will like this, actually, there's an excerpt from a book by an author named Nancy Cott, which talks about the role of women in factories and how it changes women's work. The Industrial Revolution does. And again, that sort of, idea we think of as being as traditional, which it is in some ways, it's just a more recent tradition, but women, being in the home, how she talks about how, it changes women's work, and it's very interesting. But you'll also have a nice little excerpt, by the way, from the English novelist Charles Dickens, who came to America in the 1840s and talked about, what travel in America was like on trains and stuff. So nice little stuff you get there in the textbook about in the source reader about this stuff. Yeah, and so that's the overview for this week. I wanted to address a couple of things. You guys just turn in your midterm essays. I am just now, I realize that as I'm creating this video, it's about 11:40 in the morning. My weekend's been kind of screwed up by daylight savings times. It feels like it's about 10:30, so I'm starting grading today. I should be done. I'm aiming for Thursday, but probably by Friday get the midterms done. A few of you in the feedback forum, which I appreciate you guys leaving the feedback, mentioned you were anxious about your overall grade. I was waiting till the midterms were graded to give you the grade, partly because that's one of the big chunks of your grade is the midterm. And everything we're doing, of course, is meant to sort of build toward that. The discussions, the taking notes in the source in the responses is meant to sort of gear you towards that and give you a taste of the process of how an historian creates, the stories we tell, the narratives we tell, the ideas we come up with for our histories. And so I'm gonna have that done, like I said, by the end of the calendar week, end of Sunday. I should have it done. There's going to be a little item in the grade book which says midterm grade, and it should have a letter grade and a percentage grade for you overall where you are in the course right now. So I apologize, by the way, if you were, don't get freaked out. I'm gonna get it to you, but I want to wait until that was in to get that done. So that's the hold up with that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the midterm. And I know some of you, writing is, a source of anxiety for a lot of you. A couple of things about the midterm, about essay writing in general in college. I'm going to make a confession to you. Again, I was, as you can imagine, I'm a college professor. I have my PhD. I was a good student. But in high school, I hardly ever cracked a book. My high school wasn't really all that challenging to me, which is why it was a shock when I got to college and I had to study all the time. And I say this because I don't know, a lot of you, this may be sometimes your first college course, or you go back to school, or I know a lot of you have busy schedules, jobs, and everything. I'm going to give you a few words of advice about writing any sort of long essay, more than like a page or two, in college. And the first thing, and I started doing as soon as I started having to write them in college, is start ahead of time. I mean, well ahead of time. At least 2 weeks ahead of time writing the paper. I know that sounds harsh, or like, oh my God, I don't mean, because, I tell you how I work. I have a hard time writing long stretches for long periods of time. So if you start early, you can write it smaller chunks over time. That's the other thing I'll mention besides beginning early. Break it up into small parts, pieces, and do it a little bit at a time. It's hard to do. Writing is a hard process. It also might help you to outline your papers. Outline what's what my introduction to go. It's going to be 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs. I might put the thesis in there. Where it's going to go. You should outline the body. Okay, I'm going to talk about this first, then this, then this. What evidence I'm going to have and cite for each. Those sorts of outlines, as detailed as you can. And yes, I know all this sounds tedious and it's hard work. Yes, it's hard work. College is hard work. There's no way I can't fix that for you. That's not a bug. It's a feature. That's why we actually have classes you can take for credit at JUCO. I don't think you can take them online, unfortunately, that actually help you with things like note taking. I mean, classes on note taking, how to take notes, on time management. If I know some of you are in different states, but if you ever get a chance to, take some of those classes if you can on campus, because they're very helpful. Or at least Google and do some of your own research, because it helps. Because time management is, look, I care about your schedules and I care about how busy you are. Most people in most colleges, most professors don't. Everybody's busy. Everybody's pressed for time, and so there's only so many concessions that professors can make to you. That's why I urge you to begin every big thing needs to be done. Started early. If you're waiting to the last minute to write these papers, I can almost guarantee you will not get the grade you want. Almost guarantee it. I'll give you an example from my life. You're writing, we wrote a 4 to 5 page paper was required for the midterm, right? It's tough for some of you. I know. I understand. I wrote a dissertation at the University of Kansas. It took me 2 years. It's well over 400 pages, 412, I think, by the end of it. I wrote the first 2 chapters without doing any outlines whatsoever, and I wanted to take my life by the end of this process. And then when I started the third one, I was like, well, maybe I should write an outline for this. Yeah, that would be a good idea if you're writing a 400-page book, essentially. And I did, and it made things much easier. And I began to prep out. Before I started writing, think about what you want to do real carefully, because all of a sudden you'll get stuck. And I say this, by the way, writing an outline, it can seem like a waste of time because you are going to change your mind as you go through the process of writing. That's normal. The whole reason an outline is not binding at all. It's just to give you, okay, because you sit down to write and you're like, okay, I've read this, what do I write next? And it causes anxiety, it causes stress. That's why I have the outline. At least have some idea of what you should do going forward. Because that's the biggest, when people talk about writer's block, that's the thing they're talking about. I got this done, now what do I do? And so that should help you a little bit. And so that's my advice about writing the midterm and the essays. And again, some of you don't have a problem with that. I understand, but I'm trying to get everybody as involved as I can and help you guys out. But do take that seriously. Start early if you can. Break it up into small chunks. Give yourself time, this is the other thing, before you turn it in, to revise it. Look it over. And look, I know it's hard. I don't like reading my own writing. You're like, oh man, this is, the more quickly you learn to be detached from this, the better it'll be for you. Trust me, I used to get just absolute, I was an English major as an undergraduate. I remember the first time I did a major 10-page paper. It was a medieval lit class. Fine teacher, by the way. He was a great man. I think he passed away years ago. I knew him. This is way back, University of Florida. I'm old. In the 90s. 90s. The gentleman in question was a fine teacher. He had the worst handwriting I have ever seen. I got my paper back after having turned it in, and he scribbled all over it in red ink. And I was horrified. I thought I had just failed. And I say this because he wrote all over it. I could not understand a word of it. So I'm thinking, I'm almost on the verge of tears. I get to the end of it, and there's a big long paragraph, most of which I can't read. I do get to the end of it, and it says, "Oh, this is excellent, A+." So my point to you is that, not to frighten you or anything, but that I understand your fears and anxieties, and so I want to help you. I know you guys can do this, but it's going to take hard work. It's going to take sacrifice, like anything else. So, again, thank you guys for giving me the feedback. I know, by the way, last week was a lot of hard work for you in terms of, you had to do the reading and the response, the discussion stuff, and all that sort of stuff. Again, start early on the papers so that by the time you get to that last week, you're just revising, essentially, instead of, having to do all that stuff. And you'll actually have more time for the final essay. I think you have a week. That last week, basically, you don't have anything to do, I think, in time between you turn it in. And the semester and turn it in, because that's like finals week or whatever. So, again, you have other classes and other things to do. I understand that, but you should have more time to do that for the final. But please turn it in. Oh, yes, and I will have, a sample essay for you for the final as well. Ahead of time. I apologize. I didn't get this stuff earlier. I'm busy as well. So we'll try to fix that going forward. And so that is it this week. You guys, I know it's been rough, but you've made it to the halfway point of the course. Don't give up. Keep working, keep trying, keep improving. Some of you, by the way, I've noticed I've gotten better with the discussion forums. I'm sorry I haven't left a lot of feedback for the mostly because you guys are doing what I want. I mean, less feedback means you're doing well. So keep up the good work there. I guess one last word on the responses. Again, these responses are meant to give you, experience taking notes on sources. So they'll be useful for you when you go and write the papers. And again, take a look at the final essay question right now. Go look at it. It covers a similar topic, by the way. It will ask you again about national identity in America, except this time it'll deal with the Civil War. And in fact, the rationale for that, by the way, and I'll repeat all this, maybe every week I'll talk about this actually, to emphasize how important it is for you to start early on the essays. Basically, I wanted the two essays to be connected for a reason. I want you to build on what you did earlier. You've already given it some thought, so you already know, okay, identity was this in the early 1800s. Okay, what's it like in the 1860s? What has changed? What hasn't? So you'll have some idea what to talk about, and so it won't be as hard to get started and get through things. But also because they'll be connected. History is a reflection on past events, right? As much as it is a story telling them, and so this gives you hopefully that experience doing that. And so, in sum, keep up the work, keep up the good work. All you guys have been doing good work. So, hope you guys have a great week. Hope you recover from daylight savings time pretty soon. And I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.